Hello, welcome back to Lunchtime BABLing. My name is Shea Brown. I'm the CEO of BABL AI, a company that audits algorithms for bias, ethical risk, and effective governance. I'm joined once again by our COO, Jeffery Recker. Jeffrey, thanks for stopping by.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure to jump in and have a conversation with you. Um, Really quick though, we have a lot of stuff coming up, and I think it would be good to kind of talk about it. A lot of things we're going to be at, a lot of presentations we're going to be giving. A lot of Babel people will be on the road. Uh, First, you're going to be in Washington D.C. this week. What is that? Is it open to the public? What are you talking on?
Yeah, so I'm going to be talking. It's at the DC Association. It's not being put on by the DC Bar Association. It's being put on by some conference organizer. But it's like the AI law ethics and compliance conference. If you Google that, it will show up with my name, and it's the 25th and the 26th, and I'll be speaking on the 26th. And my particular topic, it's with a lawyer from Cooley law firm, but we're talking about bias in AI systems, in particular in the context of hiring algorithms. So it's for employers to think about their liability and how they might manage that and how they might test and ask other people to test. So that will be on the 26th in Washington, D.C. at the D.C. Bar Association. It is not open to the public. It is in the sense that you can buy a ticket. I've heard it's expensive. I'm not sure how much, but in any case, you can buy a ticket, and so you just have to Google it, and it will be right there.
So, can you give us a little tease? Any little high level thoughts on that for those who might not attend?
Yeah, so the basic idea is that for most employers, so this is any big company, the you're almost guaranteed to be using some sort of algorithmic system to manage your hiring. So that could be anywhere from you use a platform like LinkedIn or Indeed or Monster.com. There are plenty of algorithms, AI algorithms operating there, which will filter kind of who you see and based on what job description you've posted, that kind of thing. Or you've actually hired a vendor, a system from a vendor to do all of that managing. And so that is where you have exposure, not just in New York City, which is, we've talked about that in this podcast before. There's a literal law that you have to make sure those systems are audited for bias. But there's a bunch of copycat laws, and the EEOC at the federal level is really has guidance on these issues. And so the long story short is, on the employer side, for these big companies, you need to start being much more demanding of the vendors and to figure out, have they been audited? Have they tested for bias if they haven't been audited externally? Have they already tested for bias? Can you get the results? You meaning the employer. And then internally, you also need to start thinking about how you're going to test your use of that system. And so what does that mean? It basically means whatever part of the funnel that algorithm is being used on. So whatever filter it's causing, you need to think about how do you collect data on either side of that, in addition to the standard EEOC data. Zeroing in on that one tool and say, can I tell whether uh, a, the likelihood a person comes out of that filter is going to depend on their protected category, like race or gender or disability status, right? And so it's just outlining those risk areas for an employer and giving them some practical tips on, like, where do you start? Ask vendors and then start thinking about testing yourself.
That'd be a really good one to be a fly on the wall for sure. Now, the bigger one I actually want to talk about is hashtag risk. We're going to be in London, October 9th and 10th at the hashtag risk conference. We're going to have a booth, and both you and I are going to be speaking. Be pretty exciting event. A lot of AI regulations, reg tech, cybersecurity, data privacy. A lot of good information there. A lot of people. It's free to attend, so if you're in the London area, feel free to come by and say hi to us. And then I'll be talking on AI procurement, what people are, you know, what kind of questions are being asked, and how to kind of solve those hurdles. And then what are you speaking on, Shay?
I'm outlining what is AI assurance. So AI assurance, of course, is what we do as a company. It's auditing, but it's really adding credibility to information that companies produce about the ways in which they do things. So I'm going to talk about that, and then I'm going to kind of introduce or tease a little bit of this new thing that we've been developing, which nobody knows about yet, but it's a new program that we've developed that I think is going to be a perfect fit for where the ecosystem is right now in terms of allowing people to get started on getting assurance and getting audits for their systems without having to be like 100% ready for everything. And I think this is the sweet spot that I'm going to highlight that is possible. We've seen it happen with a lot of the startups we've audited. There is a way of essentially just getting right down to what's important and not spending a ton of money getting some fancy consultancy to, do everything for you kind of thing. Because at the end of the day, regulations are going to still require you to do these things. And so that's what my talk is going to be about.
Yeah, that'd be another good one. And we have a lot of stuff up. I'm speaking this Friday with someone, so follow our newsletter, follow our LinkedIn, stay in touch with that. I think we'll also be at the Risk event in New York later in the year as well. So once we have more details on that, we'll let you guys know. But just kind of wanted to throw all that out there. You had a topic you wanted to bring to me this week. Usually it's me kind of trying to poke your brain, but I think you want to have a little more free flow conversation. So what you want to bring it up to the audience?
Yeah, I think so. You might have seen, I made a LinkedIn post about this, but you might have seen this Deloitte case. So basically, it's not a case. Basically, what happened is Deloitte has been building for a long time systems for a number of states, essentially to help them process uh, um, applications for. Let me bring it up before I start going off the deep end. Oh yeah, here we go. So basically, um, the Deloitte was building uh, uh, what they call the Texas Integrated Eligibility Redesign System. So it's like TIERS, TIERS, which is responsible for Medicaid eligibility determinations in Texas. Okay. Now the broader point here is that Deloitte has been rolling this similar systems out over many many states, and there have been other cases where they have found that this system, which is, I should point out, is actually not AI, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, that was actually one of my questions. So cheating a little bit. I was reading an article from the Texas Tribune about this earlier this morning, and one of my questions was just immediately like, "Is this AI, and how does this all fit into kind of the complaints?"
Yeah, so it's most likely not AI from what I can tell, um, but it is an automated decision system, right? It's making decisions autonomously based on data that comes in. Okay, so I think this has been a theme that I've talked about on this podcast, but also talked about in writing and on LinkedIn. Is that you don't need AI to harm people with these automated systems. Here's a case in point. So there's been a lot of reports about this system being biased, and so what happened is that there was a letter written to the FTC um, to complain about this. And so the letter was written by the National Health Law Program, the Electronic Privacy Information Center, so EPIC, and Upturn, which these are nonprofits. They filed a formal complaint and a request for the FTC to investigate Deloitte on this. And what they highlighted essentially is that this system is biased. They have showed some evidence for what they think is evidence for that, and they highlighted that that they meaning Deloitte should have followed the NIST AI risk management framework because they considered it to be sort of public policy, And under the FTC Act, that's something that these companies are required to do. And had they done that, they would have tested it and done some validation and figured out, hey, this is probably biased. They didn't, and so they should be investigated by the FTC. And so that was the bit. So your question, I want your feedback here on this.
Yeah, no, I mean, my first question is this question of AI. So first off, what is AI? Um, just for the broader audience, but then also how does something like the NIST AI framework help if this isn't technically an AI tool?
Yeah. So this is part of why I think this is such a confusing. Focusing on AI is really confusing. So what is AI? AI, there's going to be different definitions under the EU AI Act and different definitions. OECD has a different definition. But my definition, and I think a lot of people's definition, is it's some autonomous system or some computer based system that is doing something we would normally attribute human intelligence to do, right? Now, the bar has been changed a lot because of ChatGPT and these large language models. Our expectation about what AI is has gotten really inflated. Like we think it should be a person, basically, to have like human level kind of or close to human level kind of capabilities. That's not really what we're saying here. So this system, under my definition, pretty much is AI. Even though there's no machine learning, there's no large language models or any of that happening, it's taking in data about a person and it is making a judgment about whether they are eligible for is it Medicaid or Medicare? Let me go back and look. Medicaid. So that's something that you normally would attribute to a human, right? You like to take some information on a person to decide, are you eligible for Medicaid? That's kind of a human judgment, right? But now it's being allocated to a machine. Now, the fact that it's some basic rules or something very simple underneath the hood doesn't change the fact that I think under that definition, it's AI. But for the purposes of this is an automated system which will make consequential decisions that could affect people. And I think, regardless of the technology, the risk management framework, the whole point of it is to protect people from these sorts of things. And so I think it does apply, even though the actual underlying technology is not that fancy.
Yeah, this also echoes something that I think is an unspoken issue in the industry right now, and that is people trying to define whether or not they fit within the scope of a regulation. And what I mean by that is trying to figure out, do we need to do this? Right. And with your definition of AI, I would say just go ahead and do it. Like, don't try and, navigate your way out of something or trying to justify why you don't need to be compliant with something, because odds are, if you have impact on human life, arguing semantics isn't going to prevent you from a lawsuit down the road. If it's a hiring tool as the EEOC, if it's this particular situation is the FTC, maybe it's some financial regulations. It might not be an AI law specific, but this is probably something that, like, be proactive, not reactive about it.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I think you really hit the important point is like, is this making consequential decisions? Are there impacts that humans would feel uh, negatively in particular? I mean, of course, the positive is there, but everybody considers the positive. That's why they implement it in the first place. But is there harm? Is there infringement on fundamental rights or interests even of some stakeholders? That should be your litmus test for whether you need to have controls in place to mitigate that. Because regardless of the technology, that's a problem. Now, in this case, the technology is very basic, and so the fix may be basic. Uh, but regardless, there needs to be a fix, and we'll see whether the FTC um, actually follows through with an investigation on this. I have a feeling they will. They're at least going to reach out. If I'm sure they have already, and poke around a bit. But the thing that's interesting to me is we often get people saying, to your point, like, should I do this? Should I do that? does it really matter to me? And especially with something that's voluntary like the NIST risk management framework, they're wondering whether do I implement this at all unless somebody makes me do it. And here's a case where it was actually used in a complaint, the fact that they didn't follow that framework. Uh, and this is motivation, I think, for people to think, do I need to put something in place that's going to be a affirmative defense to say that I did my due diligence to make sure these harms weren't mitigated? And I think this is a really good example of yeah, that makes actually a lot of sense. Because if they come back and say, actually, we did follow this framework, and here are the results, and we found that this was something that was we already knew about, and it was either unavoidable or whatever. They could have some excuse about it, but if they had that implemented, that they're sort of done their due diligence, that's a defense for them.
Yeah, you hit the point I was just about to make. Is if you again be proactive versus reactive, if you put in place, say it is the NIST AI framework, having done that is probably going to benefit you in the future if something does arise. Because, and I've got 2 points here that I have in mind. One is the claim is that hundreds of thousands of Texans were wrongfully denied Medicaid at some point. I think it was because it was like a systems glitch, is how they explained it. And so this can rapidly evolve and scale pretty quick, especially with AI tools. You can, the more it's automated, the more fast something can happen. And then the other piece with the NIST AI framework is the executive order basically makes a lot of federal organizations incorporate the NIST AI framework into their organization. And so if you're selling AI tools into that system, my guess is you're going to fall within scope of it.
Absolutely. Um, I was just looking as you were talking. I was looking up to make sure because I might have misspoken about the bias issue because I feel like I mentioned bias there, and I want to make sure I don't overstate um, whether bias was an actual or whether it was simply a glitch that just messed things up. So I'm going to do a little investigation to make sure I don't get that wrong.
Yeah, so I've got a quote from Sarah Grusin. Hopefully, I'm not mispronouncing that name wrong. Senior attorney at National Health Law Program. We're hearing from whistleblowers that advocates on the ground in Texas that there are computer glitches and systems issues going on with the Medicaid eligibility system that Deloitte has provided to the state. She continued on to say, uh, and we are asking the FTC to investigate because a lot of what they're describing sounds really similar to documented problems that had occurred within other states. And before we dive into that, I also want to say Deloitte spokesperson Karen Walsh also had comments. Deloitte collaborates with hundreds of government agencies throughout the country and is deeply committed to positively impacting the people that they serve. And she continued on to say, the innovative technology systems we help states develop and maintain provide health and human service benefits to millions of families every day. In all states, we work at the direction of our clients to implement state specific policy, rules, and procedures. We are proud of the work that we do and believe this complaint is without merit. Um, so that actually makes me think of another thing as well. I genuinely don't think that any company developing these tools ever intends for any wrongdoing whatsoever. But just because of the nature of AI, sometimes it can. And part of the point in having like an AI risk framework as a guidance is basically checks on that. It's your form of checks and balances on the tools that you have. It's a way to monitor and manage and mitigate any potential risk that might arise. Um, so yeah, I just wanted to highlight those 2 points.
Yep. So it looks like, based on just looking at it now, that it's probably not a bias issue. It's much more of an effectiveness issue.
What's the difference in that?
Yeah, good point. So one is about a deficiency in the system, whether that be, let's say, really low accuracy, like it could be things like really bad false positive rates or false negative rates. Doesn't matter. Just cases where it gets it wrong when it should have got it right, or it flags something that it shouldn't have flagged, and that applies across the system. So it doesn't matter who you are or what data goes through. It sort of is problematic equally for everybody, right? Which sounds like the case here. The bias is a situation where take any one of those metrics like accuracy and measure it for a particular group classified according to some protected category like race or gender or disability status or pregnancy status or veteran status or whatever, and look at that metric and see whether it varies according to that group. And that's bias, because it may be that it's worse, the accuracy is worse for one group than another group, or whatever metric you want. And that is differential performance according to whether you belong to a protected category. And de facto, like, the understanding is that it should be equally well, it should work equally well for everybody. And so that's the crux of the issue for bias. But it's also problematic if it doesn't work well and equally for everybody. That's still a problem, as you say. Hundreds of thousands of people who get denied when they shouldn't have. That's a problem, no matter what your identity is or what group you belong to. Now that's typically a problem. I'll say, like, just as anecdotally, having worked with a lot of data scientists in these high risk areas, data scientists typically are very good at detecting or understanding or measuring that first thing, the accuracy, or like how good is it, kind of global metrics, right? Which is surprising why this one might, if it's the case that was bad, that they wouldn't have caught it. It's the bias stuff that is much harder. That is more difficult to classify, more difficult to detect, oftentimes because you don't have data to do that. But that's where we see, I would say anecdotally, where I see our clients struggling the most, is to try to figure out, what are we trying to detect? What metric do we use? How do we break data up into groups according to these demographic variables? That's hard stuff.
Well, thank you for that. I think that was actually a very needed breakdown of all of that. My next question would be, what does Deloitte do next? Say you were, in the room with decision makers. Like, what are next steps? Do you just kind of wait and see what the FTC does? Do you go ahead and implement something else? Do you go straight and put in NIST right away?
Well, I mean, I think so. First thing is, like, there's a chance, like, I don't know, like, I know that they've actually been successfully sued in other states. And so my guess is that there is something problematic, but I don't know for sure, right? So there's a chance that this is just anecdotal. They're not really getting a full picture, and that there is, in fact, not something grossly wrong with it, or that Deloitte was not kind of negligent in how they were deploying this, right? So there's a chance that this is not a huge deal. I don't know what that chance is, but there is a chance. So if I'm in Deloitte's shoes, and we've actually been in this situation with clients who are, like, facing really tough pressure, both from the press and regulators, the being open and transparent is the number one thing. And so an internal investigation, they need to investigate themselves. Like, what actually happened? Is there any merit to this? Right. And then take a look at their current governance, right? Because my guess is they did some testing. There was some governance. They need to understand, like, did we actually do enough? In all honesty, did we do enough? And hopefully the answer is yes on their part, like, if I'm advising them. But if they didn't, then I think there will be steps that they have to take.
Yeah, let me actually ask a question to that. So, when I was reading, I read that this is a tool that's actually been used for quite some years. I want to say it was since 2013. Um, so my question is, there probably is a long evidence of due diligence. If you've been using a tool for that long, you probably have a lot of due diligence done. So if you're going to go back and you're going to evaluate what have we done to be proactive about this, what are some good questions you might ask yourself to be critical of what you've already done, assuming something had gone wrong?
Okay, so in this case, you would want to understand what kind of testing did you do? Like, what kind of measurements did you do early on when this thing first was being deployed? So get a sense of, did we measure any of these important metrics that might have told us that this was a problem? Let's say you did, then you'd say, okay, what's the difference between that and this thing operating in the wild, so to speak, right? Because probably those tests would have been done with data that was not real data coming from real people. And then look at the history and say, how did we monitor this? Like, was there any kind of ongoing monitoring? That's the whole point. The reason it's in the AI Act, this post-market monitoring, is for exactly this reason. Did we have in place measurements, uh, and who was looking at that, and what actions were taken? Do we have any policies around that? And if they did, then how did those policies fall over? How did nobody notice? Did somebody notice and did nobody take action? There really needs to be kind of a forensic investigation of this and to really figure out what part of that sort of accountability chain fell over. Now, one option is that they didn't have those things in place and then maybe they relied on the states to do it, which is a legitimate thing. Maybe they built the tool and the states simply implemented them and it was their job to make sure that it didn't fall over. But they need to know that. And they didn't know, was that agreed upon in the contract? And so I think there's a lot of work to be done here, both in terms of the FTC to investigate this, but on Deloitte's part to really figure out, is this a problem in the first place? And if it is, why didn't we catch it? And then sort of trace back over that history. When did this happen? And what were the pieces of our governance that didn't work? And this in some sense is really useful for the community because one of the big problems with doing research in this area of risk management, and we do at BABL, we really care about this, so we do a lot of kind of our own research in these areas. One of the hardest things is to get evidence of like effectiveness of governance systems because it's hard to tell what you don't get the counterfactual, like what would have happened had I not had this governance in place, right? And here's an example that maybe they can identify that we didn't have that governance in place, and that's what resulted. Here we have a result of something that slipped through the cracks. So it's a good data point for the community to figure out what are the things that didn't work in this case, if indeed there is something to investigate. And so hopefully they're transparent about that when it all shakes out, so that the community can learn from this and understand, are there things that maybe they were measuring the wrong things and there was a miscommunication, and that's an important thing to know.
Yeah, I like that approach. Turn a negative into a positive, and that's a good thing to highlight too, because I think just not just risk management, but this industry in its entirety is so new. Um, there's just a lot of research to be done. So any evidence that you can get is probably quite valuable, um, in terms of like what to do and what not to do, for AI governance. I will say this as well because I don't want to come off as if we're painting Deloitte as the bad guys. I don't think that's the point of this conversation. If it's in comes off that way, it's just that sometimes bad things happens with these tools, right? And you kind of want to do the right things and react, and sometimes it's completely unintended.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be a lot to learn. Like, I think I've seen a lot of criticism leveled at Deloitte about this, and I'm holding off until I kind of see more information about exactly the things that I was talking about. But yeah, it can happen to anybody. And this is I think the point of the letter was you should have known better. And why? Because there are risk management frameworks out there that tell you to do things that had you done them, you should have noticed this, right? And this is the point that I think we're no longer in a scenario where, oh, it's a new technology, because this wasn't even AI. It's like a new technology and nobody knows what to do. And well, now we have guidelines, as potentially flawed as they are in the sense that, there's still a lot to learn about how effective some of these guardrails are that are in the framework and which are more effective than others. But nonetheless, there's guidelines out there, and according to the complaint, it should be considered kind of public policy, and that organizations that are, especially ones that are implementing systems for, like at the state or federal level, these federal contractors or state contractors, they had better be taking those things into consideration when they're building autonomous systems, because there's kind of no excuse now. It's there. And I think that my big takeaway is you can't ignore it anymore. There's no excuse. You kind of have to consider these things, even if at a very basic level. And the higher up you go on the food chain in terms of the contracts and the players you're working with, the higher the stakes and the more likely something like this will happen if you don't.
That's a good takeaway to end this one. I really really like that. I And I would say, just to the audience, again, if there's topics you want us to talk about, let us know. If there's case studies out there, like this one, throw them our way. We're happy to dive in and do a little chat over it and discuss it and pick your brain a little bit.
All right. Well, if you were watching this on YouTube, it would be great if you liked and subscribed. It helps us out a lot. We appreciate it. If you are listening to this on a podcast, thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time on Lunchtime BABLing.